The Criminalization of Climate Science Dissent, a special AGM live presentation by Michelle Sterling. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and I'm going to run through a presentation that I gave live at our recent AGM. This was a special presentation where I thought I should bring to the attention of our members a very deeply concerning trend in climate activism. The attempt to criminalize everything about climate change and climate dissent in particular. So let me walk you through the presentation, and if you'd like to put comments or questions in the comments below, please do so and we'll try and answer them. I'll also be posting this on the blog with our AGM presentation and our big book of blog posts and some of our other information about our organization for you. So with no further ado, let's look at a very serious issue. The criminalization of climate science dissent. Science is about inquiry, not compliance. The problem is that people are not paying attention to the impact of climate policy on energy. This is from the Economist of May the 10th, 2023, stating that expensive energy may have killed more Europeans than COVID-19 last winter. And there's a rise in efforts to criminalize dissent on net zero and climate policy. So Premier Scott Moe of Saskatchewan told Minister Guilbeault, "Come get me," for Saskatchewan planning to continue using coal and natural gas past the net zero target dates. Meanwhile, Minister Guilbeault tells Premier Moe that coal power past 2030 violates the criminal code. So Scott Moe wasn't having any of that. He said he wants people to be able to turn on the lights and keep the heat on in their house. And you know, Saskatchewan's right out here in the prairies right beside Alberta. It's very cold in winter, and wind and solar are not reliable at the best of times, but certainly not in winter. You can have, what do they call it in German, Dunkelflauten or something like that. You can have days and weeks actually with no wind and very little sun. So that's not a solution for heating our homes and keeping the lights on. Not to mention, in Alberta, we are now heavily reliant on importing coal power from Saskatchewan because we shut down our coal plants to save the planet, and now we're very reliant on that extra coal power that we get from Saskatchewan. So it's a very serious situation. We're talking about life and death, and our Minister of Environment is turning it into a criminal offense to keep people alive. Think about that for a minute. So there's a lot of censorship and groupthink going on. If you recall, Melissa Fleming, who's the Undersecretary for Communications at the UN, told the world that we own the science, that they had partnered with Google to make sure that all the UN propaganda is at the top of the search engine. There are reports like fault lines, which we did a very big deconstruction of this and of a CBC report on it. We were the only group named in this report, done by a very big bevy of researchers with a multi-million-dollar budget attacking our tiny little group of professionals. There's another group out in the UK who did deny, deceive, and delay. They claim that they want to have climate dialogue, but they actually only want climate monologue. And of course, in the US, under the umbrella of the Columbia Journalism Review, they run a program called Covering Climate Now, which has about 400 media partners reaching 2 billion people around the world. And in one of their first journal publications, they interviewed the director of the film Mad Max, that dystopian film, who was teaching them how to make climate fear compelling. That doesn't sound like journalism to me. That sounds like propaganda. That's what they're up to. Now, of course, all of this completely violates Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations, which is everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and includes the freedom to hold opinions without interference. And in March 2023, there were some terrifying headlines, as usual, coming out of the AR6 report, the Synthesis Report, and the UN calls for everything, everywhere, all at once on climate action, and a livable future for all is possible if we take urgent climate action, flagship UN report. So this happened on March the 20th. This is the cover of the report. In fact, they only issued the summary for policymakers at that time. The full report had not been done. So what was the rush? Oh, yes, also they put this out everywhere. This was terrifying in the press. This was very proliferated in the press. And you can see what they're trying to imply is that, like, boomers had it great, and now we're going to fry our kids. Now, of course, the reports don't say that. And the only way you arrive at this conclusion is if you're using these implausible scenarios. But of course, the average person doesn't know that. You see that, and it's terrifying. But right after all that scary stuff came out, also in March 2023, Vanuatu, that tiny little country out there in the South Pacific, asked the UN General Assembly to ask the World Court to rule on national climate obligations. So that's why there was a rush to get that report out. And the General Assembly votes to seek the World Court's opinion in a quest for bolder climate action. So there's the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So why should we be concerned about that? Well, CLINTEL has shown that there's faulty science being undertaken, that there's faulty process in the development and issuing of these reports. We know that climate tyranny is a rising theme. We know that corporations, countries, and individuals are threatened by climate crime legal actions. And we also know that competitor nations like China and Russia have exploited environmental non-governmental organizations to agitate for policies that cause degrowth and civil collapse in the West. And the best example is probably this one out of Europe, where in fact environmentalists were financed by Russia, and because of their push for green energy and reliance on natural gas from Russia, it turned out that the EU is actually funding the war against Ukraine, or the conflict against Ukraine, however you want to put it. So think of the risks of an international climate compliance law with all these factors all messed up together. Imagine what a legal ruling on climate obligations could mean for you and your country. Imagine the potential incitement. So here are just some headlines from the past few years. Climate change deniers don't deserve an equal voice. That's not democratic. Kill climate deniers. That's a play out of New Zealand, I believe. So that's nice. He sounds nice, eh? Arrest climate change deniers. And climate prosecution is deeply embedded in the climate activist legal community. If you recall, in 2015, Eco-Justice went after us, and one of the main complainants, ironically, was Stephen Lewis, who's a human rights activist. He's received dozens of awards and honorary degrees around the world for his human rights activism for freedoms, but I guess not freedoms for us and our little billboard. They actually wanted us fined and thrown in jail for our billboards. So we can see that this paper was written in 2012. It's frequently cited by legal people. Deceitful tongues, is climate change denial a crime? And speaking of Vanuatu, these are people from West Coast Environmental Law working with a similar organization in Vanuatu. You can find out more about that in our report, Manufacturing a Climate Crisis. And of course, there's Polly Higgins' famous movement to have ecocide included in legislation regarding genocide. So Eradicating Ecocide is her book. But think what this could be. We're really moving into an era of top-down climate tyranny. So this is from Deutsche Bank. This is how they think the world should be rebuilt, with an eco-dictatorship. And this person says, I know that eco-dictatorship is a nasty word, but we may have to ask ourselves the question whether and to what extent we may be willing to accept some kind of eco-dictatorship in the form of regulatory law in order to move toward climate neutrality. Here's an example. What should we do if property owners do not want to turn their houses into zero-emission buildings, if they do not have the financial means to do so, if doing so is not possible for technical reasons, or if the related investments do not pay off? So their solution is, instead of trying to find some method of finance or to do a proper assessment without RCP 8.5 as the scary scenario and recognize that you don't have to turn every house into a net zero house, their plan is to have an eco-dictatorship. This is a German bank thinking about an eco-dictatorship. That's pretty serious in my view. And this kind of thinking is quite predominant in many climate activist circles. So here's Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, claiming that today's IPCC Working Group 1 report is code red for humanity. And of course, in CLINTEL's assessment of the AR6 report, they find that that is not what the report said. So CLINTEL wrote to Dr. Hoesung Lee, who's the chair of the IPCC, and said that, this was not said in the report. And the IPCC never corrected Antonio Guterres, nor did they challenge any of the similarly inaccurate media coverage that distorts the contents of your report. And there's more and more books and papers showing that climate emergency is a false alarm. All three of these are excellent books, especially if you read Swedish. No, I'm kidding. It's actually in English as well. And of course, can you imagine how upset Greta must be that one of her own countrymen is telling her that climate emergency is a false alarm? So CLINTEL's report, I think, will be a turning point because it's done by a very high-level group of experts, and they have broken down the themes of the IPCC that seem to be very consistent and frozen in time, that this is a recurring theme in every report. Current warming is unique or unprecedented, climate change is all bad, and it's all caused by CO2. But that's not what the findings are. And they say that the evidence that CO2 and other greenhouse gases are causing dangerous climate change is, even after 30 years and 6 major IPCC reports, rather thin. And in fact, the largest emitter in the world is China, and here's Canada way down here. So whatever Canadians are doing is not going to have one iota of impact on reducing global emissions. As CLINTEL has shown, there is no climate emergency. Where is the crisis? And in fact, for Canadians, our contribution is 0.019 degrees Celsius warming over the past 100 years. And for Alberta, our contribution is 0.0066 thousandths of a degree Celsius. So these are immeasurable amounts of warming. But the good news is, the extreme scenario that the IPCC saw as most likely in 2013 is now judged low likelihood. So Roger Pielke Jr. also did his own assessment and analysis of the IPCC reports. And he tells us clearly that RCP 8.5, RCP 6.0, these are implausible scenarios, and so when you look at this graph without them, you can see the climate emergency is over. We do have time. Now, what's really important is there is actually a spectrum of views on climate change. And because we live in a democracy, as with any topic, there will be diverse points of view and demands for change depending on one's values. So we have to find solutions that are cost-effective and reasonable. So this is our climate diversity chart. Controlling carbon is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. So Richard Lindzen said that many, many years ago, and he's absolutely right. But just think, if the Court of Justice, International Court of Justice, makes a ruling for climate compliance, well, if you make a global carbon law, then you control the world. So say no to global climate gulag. Say no to climate CO2 coercion. And hopefully you'll join us. If you're not already a member, please join us. Please share our materials. You can sponsor some work of ours. You can donate. You can send an e-transfer, or you can donate online. And you can join here too. So the benefit of joining is that you will also get our bi-monthly newsletters, CLISI and extracts, that give you a quick roundup of recent events, whether it be in the political realm for extracts or whether it be in climate science papers and energy articles in the CLISI newsletter. You'll also get our press releases and our reports. You can subscribe or unsubscribe depending on your preference to these materials, and you'll help us for a very nominal sum. You'll help us go forward and continue our work. We're now into our 21st year of operation, so we're pretty proud that we've kept up our tradition of providing free climate science insights for the public and policymakers, and we'd like to continue doing that. If you can help us, that would be great. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling. Thanks for watching. Please feel free to leave comments in the space below, and I'll also be posting this on our blog along with the PowerPoint so you can look at it closer.